Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the last Majlis of the spring term. We will continue on the 29th of April. And today's guest is Philipp. And Philipp is known to many of us in the institute. But nevertheless, I would like to introduce him. And you know that what I wrote to the participant of this Majlis that we all online we present ourselves like with our best pictures, best like icons and like superheroes, and what is interesting is to see the real human being behind the superhero. Now I'm saying this because the closest human being to a superhero I've ever met in actual life is Philipp. So I saw him coming to give a lecture on a skateboard, and he is as familiar in the quarters of Shi'i clerics of Kerbala as with the rappers of Western European cities. In fact, one of my memorable memories of Philipp is when we had him at the institute and he talked about his research on Muslim rappers. And then Professor Ian Netton, who is quite an experienced warrior in the field, he asked with really immensely impressed that how did you manage to get to them, and how did you manage that they would speak to you? And then Philipp replied modestly that I believe I have some street credit. And then I wanted a follow-up question, and I asked Philipp, could you please elaborate on this? And then Philipp said, no. Yes, he's as a scholar, he's Austrian, so as a scholar he is as colorful as Mozart is as a musician. And bigger compliment I don't think I will be able to produce ever in my life. So Philipp, please do entertain us with your story and history and your research.
Thanks, Istvan, for the very flattering introduction. I'm glad to see so many friends from the Exeter Circle and others as well. I hope the Wi-Fi connection is not letting me down. Just as far as procedure is concerned, should I start with the topic of the day right away and situate it somehow in my personal research history, or what would you prefer?
Well, I would prefer you to talk about your history, including your research history. You can start with the history of your ancestors and go on. I would be actually very interested in all this. So you can start wherever you would like to start, and then somehow normally there is no normally, because everyone does this in a different way, and I never know what our guest would do, and it's always immensely interesting. So then eventually you would end up your own story at a point where you reach your actual research and you talk about this.
All right, this sounds good. So as Istvan already mentioned, I'm Austrian. I come from a Austrian steel town, the city of Linz, which was just Samir wrote that I should not mention it, that I grew up in Linz, but that's how the story starts. Yeah, as I said, Austrian steel town, which was one of the formative and favorite places of Adolf Hitler, unfortunately. Yeah, right from my family background, I can say that from my father's side, I was born into a family that was running a Wirtshaus, as they say in Austria, or a restaurant, traditionally, which then moved into into grocery stores, basically. Whereas my mother comes from we could say, a fairly underdeveloped area of the province of Upper Austria, which borders the Czech Republic, which is of a decidedly rural background, we can say. As far as my trajectory to the field of Islamic studies is concerned, this trajectory started very much in my home, because my father took a keen interest in things Near Eastern, things Oriental, and things Islamic. So he never attended university or anything because he had to work in the family business. But on the side, yeah, he bought a lot of books on Arab history, Islamic history, on especially also on Sufism. So basically, for some time, he also was what we would call today like a New Age Sufi. So I grew up in a house which was already full of books on Near Eastern studies, maybe more pop science than strictly academic titles, but still. And on the other hand, also a lot of Sufi literature, especially of the type that became popular in the West in the 60s and 70s. And he also learned Arabic, first from a Tunisian teacher and then from an Egyptian friend during my childhood. So yeah, my exposure to the field I already got at home, basically, in my childhood. I have three siblings. None of them went into that field, but evidently it spoke to me. And because of that upbringing, I already visited places like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iran during my school days. So I really had early exposure to the field, and I can say that when I was about to finish school, I was very much devoid of any real plans for the future. I only knew that I was interested in history, in languages. So when I coincidentally found out about course of study, Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Vienna, I didn't give it much thought, but just decided this is what I'm going to do. And as you can see, I stuck with it until today. Although my academic trajectory has been a bit of unusual. I already had a family with children when I was 21 years old. Until very recently, I was always working multiple jobs, most of them outside of academia, to sustain both the family and the academic life. So to me, it's still a very recent development that now in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working, as we could say, a full-time academic in the university system and in research. So in the meantime, for instance, I was an airport worker for 20 years or even 21 years. I also worked as a social worker for a couple of years with refugees, primarily from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And yeah, also these jobs, of course, gave me different insights into present Muslim life and Muslim realities, especially in Western European countries. So at least I can hardly be charged with doing the science or gaining all the knowledge just from the position of the ivory tower, basically, because, for example, at the airport, I mostly did manual work, baggage work, freight work, airplane cleaning. So many of my colleagues, of course, had a Muslim migratory background. Yeah, then to get a bit into the story of which areas have been my main fields of research in recent years. So I basically began academic research already before starting on my MA, because a friend of mine who is a great historian of Iberian colonial history and also modern Caribbean and history and history of Latin America. He took me to a trip to Colombia, Venezuela, and the Dutch Antilles. And he just told me, I'm going to do the Sephardic Jews and you will do the Syro-Lebanese. And at that point, I didn't even know that there were Syro-Lebanese or notable Syro-Lebanese communities in places like Colombia and Venezuela. But he just pushed me into it, and that was actually my first combination of field work and archival research, which I was thrown into basically in Colombia and Venezuela and the Dutch Antilles. After that, through the trip, I found out that's just what I want to do, this type of research, a combination of textual research combined with field work. Therefore, I wanted to do my MA more thoroughly on Syro-Lebanese Muslim communities in South America, specifically Colombia. But at that time, Colombia was still a place considered very dangerous, with around 2,000 abductions a year. And of course, the civil war still in full swing. So my wife simply said, I'm not going there with you and with our son. So I had to find another research site. But I was very much interested in Muslim minority contexts since my Colombian and Venezuelan experience. So I was looking around for other suitable sites of research, and I found something at the other end of the world, namely Indochina. So I found out about the Muslim communities, the Muslim minorities, the autochthonous Muslim minorities of Vietnam and Cambodia. Yeah, decided that's something I should look into more thoroughly. Beginning in 2005, I embarked on research on Islam in Indochina, which of course meant engaging with the wider sphere of Southeast Asian Islam. So it was necessary to get acquainted with classical Malay, with modern Malaysian language and modern Indonesian. And as you will see later in the presentation, it also, the reason for today's presentation is also my research on Cambodia, because I did a lot of work on connections between Indo-Chinese Muslims and Malay Muslims, specifically on the Malay Peninsula. So apart from these Muslim minority contexts in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, I also have one more or less persistent research focus, which is more concerned with textual studies, and this concerns the Maturidi school of Kalam, or of rational theology or dialectic theology. So this was something I was thrown into in my early university days, when one of my teachers, she said, you will give a presentation on the Maturidiyya, and there was even there was at an early date where you didn't really hear much about the Maturidiyya, even at institutes of Islamic studies. So I was a bit baffled who these Maturidi guys were, and I found out that there was at that time, early 2000s, still very much a dearth of research. And yeah, this was something I also took great interest in. So yeah, at least as a side project, I've been working on the Maturidi school, and specifically on its expansion and on its post-classical sphere. We can say now for 1.5 decades, perhaps more. And then finally, what Istvan already mentioned, part of my work on Islam in the Americas then became the research field on what we could call Black or African American, Afro-Caribbean Islam, whereas the first field of research actually was, as Istvan mentioned, the relationship between Islam and hip hop music in the Americas, which was a very interesting project for me, and also one which necessitated much less travel than one would expect, because my hometown has been known as the hip hop Mecca of Austria. So I just got on my bike and took a 10-minute bike ride to a venue in Linz to interview American rappers coming to town. So which were very interesting talks, and as Istvan mentioned, it was helpful for me to have some kind of street credibility. On the other hand, starting out from this research project on the relationship between Islam and hip hop, I delved deeper into the sphere of African American Muslim movements, because it was only through this engagement with the rappers and their different references to Islamic groups that I actually became aware how diverse this field is, and how diverse it has been at least since the 1960s. So the last step basically on that in that research field was to combine these two spheres, like the Latin American, the Caribbean, and the US American, because I did more or less, at least to my knowledge, the first broader study on the expansion of African American Muslim movements beyond the US. So that is to Canada, to Trinidad, to other Caribbean and South American countries, and also to Great Britain, especially to places like Brixton, for example, or Bristol should also be mentioned. So I think, yeah, there was a broad overview over, yeah, my topics of research in the last basically almost, yeah, it's now, we can say 20 years since I exactly 20 years since I went on my trip to Colombia. So there was an overview over my 2 decades of research in Islamic study.
Well, thank you very much, Philipp. You know, not just your whole story, but the beginning is also interesting. I don't remember anyone having said in these majlises that it was from their father or mother they would have sourced the inspiration, which could be a very obvious source. But you are the first to mention this, and of course, it's also interesting that how important is what a teacher says to us. I started it in Al-Muqaffa because I was given the Risala of Sahaba by a teacher of mine, that you read it like your teacher said. You give a presentation on it, and then it can determine all our research for decades. And yeah, well, there are so many lessons. I really hope that many people will see this, because yeah, just working in an airport for 21 years, and yeah, with baggages and cleaning airplanes and so on, while doing stellar research. Okay, so yeah, this gives indeed an example. Why I started talking now is to ask you what, because it would be very interesting if you could say some words on this. What were the most difficult things for you in all this, or what are now the most difficult things, and how do you deal with them, if you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I can say I never had problems with approaching people, or also gaining a a certain amount of confidence from people, and I hope that I haven't ever betrayed that confidence granted to me in very different contexts, like between Cambodia and Brooklyn or and Colombia. But what I can say was most difficult for me and still is I just hate grant writing, and I I hate writing applications. So so you said, yeah, working 20 plus years at the airport is like a lesson, but on career wise, it is of course a very bad decision, you know. But on the other hand, I could make a living without being forced to writing grant applications and such all the time. But the downside, of course, is yeah, that I'm lacking the skills to a certain extent, and it's also a very important gap in my CV, basically. So it's great if someone in the audience appreciates the 20 years as a baggage worker, but somebody looking at an application in the university system usually doesn't appreciate it, but he is looking for where is the third party funding that was that I got, you know. So I would say that that's the part of academic life I'm the least used to, and it's also what I find most difficult. So I think that's a very, from my perspective, I have a very easy answer to your question. It's quite obvious actually.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. We will have time for more questions. Please talk to us about your present research.
Yeah, all right. So then, yeah, before getting into the topic, of course, you might already all have guessed that I'm a bit of a unstable scholar. So I'm always pulled into different directions, several different directions at the same time. So also, I think last year I've did a lot of work on, as I said, African American Muslim movements. But on the other hand, I returned stronger to the Southeast Asian leg of research as well, basically with two different projects. One is that I'm doing research on the production of Malay, on the printing of early Malay Islamic books in the Middle East, that is in Mecca and in Cairo. And the second area, which is somehow related, but not too much related to the other project, is the one on a particular scholarly family from Kelantan in the northeast of Malaysia. And yeah, that's the topic of today's talk. So I will just get right into it, and then you will see what it's all about. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. I'm
Okay.
just trying to move into the presentation. Here's the presentation mode. Can you see the presentation mode?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Mm-mm.
Okay, because it's pretending to be the presentation mode. Let's see. Now?
Yes.
All right. That's better. Okay. Yeah. So this story is about a family tradition of Islamic reform, which in its present manifestation and calls itself the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah, which is already a bit startling because, of course, Shāh Walī Allāh al-Dihlawī was a South Asian scholar working in a Persian, then Urdu, Hanafi context, whereas Southeast Asia is dominated by the Shafi'i school of law, and Persian hasn't played a major role in Southeast Asia since the early 16th century, and Urdu basically never has. So part of the exercise will be to explain how this came about, that there is a scholarly family and a scholarly circle built around them in present-day Malaysia that draws its chief inspiration from the 18th century South Asian scholar Shāh Walī Allāh Dihlawī. Yeah, this brings us back to the beginning of my description of my personal trajectory. So as I said, beginning in 2005, I was working on the Muslim minority, the Cham ethnicity, Muslim minority of Vietnam and Cambodia. One aspect of this research, I'm very much interested in networks. So I was strongly looking at scholarly networks linking Cambodian Muslim scholars, Vietnamese Muslim scholars, with scholars in the Malay world and also with Malay scholars in Mecca in the 19th and 20th century. So most of the scholars I was working on, they were part of what you can say the traditionalist spectrum of Southeast Asian Islam. So devoted followers of the Shafi'i school, who primarily used classical Malay written in Arabic script in their scholarly discourse. But then I also found out that there was one scholar by the name of Lee Musa in eastern Cambodia. He was killed in 1975, like most Islamic scholars and Islamic functionaries, I have to say. He was killed during the reign of Bruckmayr, who managed to physically do away with around 90% of religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders in Cambodia, meaning imams, religious teachers, and hakem, so-called hakem village leaders. So one of the many scholars they killed was Lee Musa, and I found out that he had been a rather controversial figure, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, because he was a very adamant reformist scholar and Islahi to a certain extent in the tradition of Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida. And I found out that also Lee Musa, like many others, had studied in Malaysia. Most Cambodian students went to either Patani in southern Thailand or to Kelantan in northern Malaysia. And he had a local teacher there who imbued him with this reformist spirit, imbued him with ideas that were perceived as very controversial among Cambodian Muslims. For example, that he rejected taqlid within the Shafi'i school, that he advocated the translation of the Quran into the Cham language, that he advocated education, both Islamic and secular, for women, that he wore Western dress, as you can see, and that's another topic that will come up later in the talk. He even kept a dog at his house, which was considered a no-go by local scholars. And so I found out that Lee Musa and some other Cambodian scholars, they studied with a Malay scholar from Kelantan by the name of Wan Musa Ibn Abdul Samad, who was also a former mufti of the state of Kelantan. So that was my first connection to the scholarly family I will be talking about today. So it all came basically via Cambodia, by studying the teachers of Cambodian scholars of the mid-20th century. Meanwhile, as I said, this research began in 2005. Many years later, actually just last year, I got in contact with one of the grandsons of the mentioned Malay scholar, one of the grandsons of Wan Musa, that is Ni Abdulaziz Ni Hassan, who we can say is the present intellectual leader of the family reformist movement, the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. And through the contact to Ni Abdulaziz, I got a lot of first-hand information, of course, but as you will see, I also got access to very fascinating documents on which most of today's presentation will be based. Now, just a few words about geography. Here we see Indochina, Vietnam, and the south of Cambodia. So students from there, they went to study primarily in Pattani, in southern Thailand, or in Kelantan at the very northeast of present-day Malaysia, which have both been important scholarly centers since the 19th century. And that's where most of present talk will take place, is around Kota Bharu, the capital of the Malaysian state of Kelantan. Now, the story of the family begins actually a bit north of the border in present-day Thailand. It begins with a Sufi scholar by the name of Tuan Tabal, who died in 1894. Here we have a very nice photo from the family archive. This is a tree under which Tuan Tabal supposedly engaged in dhikr and other Sufi exercises. And he is basically, he's the beginning of the story. This presentation will revolve less about Tuan Tabal, but more about his descendants in Malaysia. So just to see the breadth of the network we are talking about. So in the beginning, we have Tuan Tabal himself, who was born in southern Thailand, then studied in Mecca, where he took a specific Sufi path, namely the Aḥmadiyya-Idrīsiyya tariqa, which originated in Morocco. And he was the first scholar to bring the Ahmadiyya to Kota Bharu in Malaysia. Then his son, Wan Musa, was already born in Kota Bharu, then also studied in Mecca, took the Ahmadiyya also there from a local shaykh, not from his father, but from a major shaykh in Mecca, and came back to Kota Bharu, where he was recruited by the Sultan to become the state mufti. On the other hand, with Wan Musa, something new comes into the family tradition, namely a clear reformist strand. So Wan Musa, during his stay in Mecca, he became aware of Al-Manar, of the Islamic reform movement in Cairo around Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida, and he even began to correspond with Rashid Rida and became a spearhead of what was called the Kaum Muda movement. Kaum Muda meaning the young group or the new group, so a group propagating Islamic thought in Southeast Asia. And he also had connections to Kaum Muda scholars in Singapore, because Kaum Muda was very much the first center of the Islamic reformists in the western part of the Malay Indonesian world. Then we move to the next generation, the sons of Wan Musa. First, we should mention Abdullah. He brings in the decisive element for the family tradition, and that is that during his studies in Mecca, he got in touch with a famous South Asian scholar, part of the Deobandi tradition, that is Ubaidullah Sindhi, actually a convert from Sikhism to Islam, who became a major propagator of the thought of Shāh Walī Allāh al-Dihlawī, and he inducted basically Mir Abdullah as the first Southeast Asian scholar into what he called the path of al-Dihlawī. When Abdullah returned from Mecca to Kelantan, he brought still a new element into the Islamic sphere of Kelantan, but also into the family tradition. That is the teachings of Sindhi and Shāh Walī Allāh. Then mention should also be made of the youngest brother of the Abdullah, Le. He was much younger, was also born in Kota Baru, and the connection to Ubaidullah Sindhi already existed because of his elder brother. So when he was sent to Mecca, he studied with Sindhi, and after Sindhi was allowed by the colonial authorities to return to the British Empire domains in South Asia, because he had been as an exile, a political exile in Mecca. Midley also moved to South Asia to study at the Dar al-Ulum Deoband, and later to study at Sindhi's Beit al-Hikmah in Delhi. So we now here see with Midley a strong connection to South Asian circles of Islamic learning, to Deoband, and then specifically to Sindhi's Beit al-Hikmah in Delhi, which of course was again a new element for Islam on the Malaysian peninsula. There had been no prior connection actually to Deoband or South Asian scholarship in general, primarily because of the barrier of different schools of law. But beginning with Wan Musa, the family, the descendants of Tuan Tabal, began to reject Taqlid within the Shafi'i school, and also became open to study with other La Madhabiyya scholars or scholars within the Hanafi spectrum. I already presented now the next generation, one of the great grandsons of Tuan Tabal, Abdulaziz Hassan, who is, we can say, presently the intellectual leader of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah in Malaysia. As I said, the tradition of reform basically begins with Man Musa, the son of Tuan Tabal, although already Tuan Tabal was significant in bringing the Aḥmadiyya-Idrīsiyya tariqah to Malaysia, which is one of the tariqahs that has been discussed under the framework of Neo-Sufism. Whatever one may think of that label, the use of the label already suggests that it was a bit different than the traditional tariqahs. Now, Wan Musa, as I said, for him, the Ahmadiyya connection remained important throughout his life. So he was patronizing other Ahmadi sheikhs in Kelantan. But what became the most important influence to Wan Musa was his engagement with reformist thought emanating from Cairo. So even though he himself studied under traditional scholars, primarily under the Shafi'i Mufti of Mecca, Ahmad Zaini Dahlan, he came to fully embrace the discourse of the Al-Mana group and of Rashid Rida, perhaps with the one exception that Wan Musa very much remained faithful to at least certain expressions of organized Sufism, such as in the form of the Ahmadiyya. On the other hand, he was very much in line with Rashid Rida in critiquing Taqlid as one of the supposed reasons for Muslim backwardness, for one of the supposed reasons of backwardness of Islamic law. And he was also shared the same line of thought as far as ritual practices considered as bid'ah were concerned. So this is a very interesting document, for example, a question which Wan Musa, at the time when he was himself the state mufti of Kelantan, he sent a fatwa request to Rashid Rida, which was then also published in Al-Manar. And the question was about Talqin al-Mayit, that is implanting knowledge into the dead to prepare him or her for the questioning of the grave. As you can see here on this picture, a very popular practice in Southeast Asia, as is also visible in manuals which give the text of the taklid for users to carry it out. So this was one of the practices which Wan Musa strongly criticized as being bid'ah, as being insufficiently based on prophetic practice, and of course, as can be expected, Rashid Rida fully confirmed his opinion. And this also expectedly, these and other points on which Wan Musa was very stern, it brought him into conflict with local scholars, and he also got into serious conflict with the Sultan, who had appointed him as the state mufti of Kelantan. One of the chief reasons for the conflict with the Sultan was that the Sultan wanted to build a new major mosque in his capital, which would later be known as the Masjid Muhammadi. You see, it's a very beautiful mosque, a very large mosque. Of course, it's a building of brick and mortar, whereas the old Friday Mosque of Tak Bai was a wooden building, as was customary during this period. So at that time, early 20th century, the sultans of the Malay sultanates, because of British colonial power, they were very much deprived of their authority. The only thing that was officially left to them was religion and custom. So one field of activity became to build Grand Friday mosques. But to build a Grand Friday mosque, you of course need money. So the Sultan of Kelantan, as other sultans, as you can see here in a fatwa, which is from a few decades earlier, they fell upon the idea that they could partly finance such mosque buildings by using portions of zakat al-fitr for mosque building. And Wan Musa was very stern about this point, that from his perspective, this was an illegal use of money destined for the poor. So he was very adamant that the Masjid Muhammadi could not be built in a Shari way, in that fashion. And we can see how stern a scholar he was. After the Masjid Muhammadi was built, until his death, he refused to go there for Friday prayers, because from his perspective, it was built in a non-Shari fashion. On the other hand, he also ran into problems with the Sultan because he made decisions in inheritance cases which were to the detriment of the Sultan. So in the end, things came to a head. Wan Musa stepped down from his position as state mufti, and instead the Sultan of Kelantan, he founded the first centralized administrative body for the administration of Islam on the whole Malay Peninsula, the so-called Majlis Ugama of Kelantan, the Council for Islamic Religion and Malay Custom of Kelantan. Here we see the main figures in its foundation. So the Mufti is not included. So there begins basically a long history of marginalization of the reform current manifested by the descendants of Tuan Tabal. He also got into conflict with traditional Malay scholars on other issues, for example, the question of sustaining the niyyah, the intention during prayer, which is a very important topic in Shafi'i thought, but I'm not getting into the details here. We now rather continue with Wan Musa's son, Li Abdullah, the one who first brought the teachings of Shāh Walī Allāh to Kelantan after he became acquainted with Ubaydullah Sindhi in Mecca and became his student. So as you see, Li Abdullah He died very young. He died in 1935, so even his death even predated his father's death. So his influence in Kelantan was necessarily short-lived because he only returned from Mecca in 1934 and died only 8 months later. But by continuing his father's strand of reform thought, now enhanced with the teachings of Sindhi and al-Dihlawī, also he managed to cause quite a stir in his native Kelantan. Yeah, here's one of the few images we have of Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was one of the main popularizers of Shāh Walī Allāh. So perhaps that Shāh Walī Ullah is such a big figure within South Asian Islam in general these days, owes at least to a certain extent to the work of Ubaidullah Sindhi and his interpretation of Dihlawī. I said that also Mir Abdullah managed to cause quite a stir in Kelantan. In his case, it was a very specific debate that gained a lot of public attention, and there was a debate about dog saliva. So as you can see on this nice picture here, we have Van Musa here because it was shot. The picture was shot already after the death of Mir Abdullah. So his father more or less took over his cause. Now the background to the story is that one of the members, one of the princes of the royal family, he kept a Dalmatian dog, namely this dog here on the picture, and the traditional scholars said this cannot be done. If he gets polluted by dog saliva, he has to take a full ablution, and because they were going by the Shafi school, which is very sensible about pollution by dogs, specifically by dog saliva. On the other hand, Mir Abdullah, he ruled based on the Maliki school, that this is not that much of a problem at all, and advised the Kelantanese prince to just go by the Maliki position for his religious practice. So even though this seems like a minor issue, it developed into a very big debate about the necessity of taqlid and about the permissibility of talfiq, that is taking rulings from different schools of law. So out of this small point of ritual law basically developed a very grand debate, which was started by Mir Abdullah's advice, but then his cause, as I said, because of his premature death, was taken over again by his father, Van Musa. And on this picture, we also see the connections developed here. So the person holding the Dalmatian dog, that's, by the way, the Sultan of Kelantan. The person holding the Dalmatian dog, Haji Abbas Taha, was a Singaporean scholar of Hadrami descent, who was one of the spearheads of the Islamic reformist movement in Singapore, and went all the way up to Kelantan to join the public debate about dog saliva and taqlid and talfiq. Here we see him up close, and he also wrote the treatise Risala Penting, an important epistle on the question of dog saliva according to the four schools of law. So we are not even yet at the stage of La Madhabiyya, but it's a discussion about talfiq within the established schools of law. And Mir Abdullah, in his take on the subject, of course, also relied on Shāh Walī Allāh Dihlawī because he is well known for being a bit skeptical about taqlid al-madhab. So we now jump to Mir Abdullah's youngest brother, Nikleh. As I said, he and some of his cousins and other brothers, they were the first ones to no longer just study in Malaysia and in Mecca, but they went directly to where Sindhi was active first to Dar al-Ulum Deoband, and then afterwards, because Sindhi moved away from Deoband to establish his own institute at the Jamia Millia Islamiyya in Delhi, this Malaysian contingent from Kelantan followed Sindhi to Delhi to study there in his Beit al-Hikmah, the self-avowed goal of which was teaching the Tariq, the path of Shāh Walī Allāh. And here we see another brother from the family, Mahmud, standing here together with Asindi and other scholars at the Beit al-Hikmah in Delhi. When Le returned after the Second World War from Deoband and Delhi to Kelantan, it did not take long until also he managed to cause a major stir in Kelantanese religious affairs. One of the reasons was that he published a treatise on the question of Zakat Fitr. This time it was not about mosque building, but this time it was about the question if children, as it says here, if children or if Zakat al-Fitr has to be paid for children as well, which was the practice of the religious council of Kelantan, a practice which Nitle declared to be wrong. And if he had had his way, this would, of course, have had very detrimental effects on the financial resources of the religious council of Kelantan. So this was a big issue. So Nitle even had to go to the Sharia court, as you can see here, to defend himself for his position on Zakat al-Fitr. Other controversial issues he was writing about were education for females, which was at that time also still perceived as very controversial among traditional Malay scholars. So the Kelantanese Council of Religion also sought to have some of his books banned, notably one book called The Philosophy of Having a Family Household, in which he expressed his reformist ideas about the role of women in religion, in the public sphere, and also in education. Here is one picture with Nitle here in the middle with his students. So even though the Religious Council of Kelantan did its best to marginalize him in the public sphere, he still had an influence via his students, which not only came from Malaysia, but also in this case, this is a Cambodian scholar I recognized on the basis of other photos. So he also had some international students. What's also interesting is that starting with Nitle, the family history also begins to intersect with the main developments in Malaysian politics. So among, I don't know if he's in this crowd, but among the students of Nitle at that time was also Abdulaziz Nikmat, who is the most well-known figure of the Malaysia's Islamist opposition party, the Parti Islam se Malaysia, and who was also Prime Minister of Kelantan from 1990 to 2013. So a very long-running Prime Minister who cemented the dominance of Malaysia's Islamist opposition party in Malaysia, in Kelantan, and in the northeast of Malaysia in general. So also Abdulaziz Nikmat was for some time part of the circle of Nitle, and he even also went to study at Deoband, but in the end he broke away from Nitle's circle because their ideas on politics, but also on religious matters, they diverged quite a bit. And this can already be seen in the style of dress. So we see here the Abdulaziz Nikmat, who always dressed in the garb of a traditional Malay religious scholar, whereas Mitlay and his family can be seen here, at least for this occasion, dressed in traditional sarongs, partly, but partly also dressed in Western dress, and all the women with no hijab. So already on these superficial aspects like dress, we can see how far Mitlay and his erstwhile student Abdulaziz Nikmat diverged. By the way, the PAS party under Abdulaziz became very famous for its call for an Islamic, for turning Malaysia into an Islamic state, and for his attempt to introduce a hudud bill, including corporal punishment in Kelantan, which was a populist move that could not be put into law because criminal law is federal law in Malaysia and not legislated on state level. Yeah, just a few of the works of Mitlay. He engaged very thoroughly with the Quran. So he has an unpublished series of a course on tafsir and Quran interpretation, the Kuliah Pengajian al-Quran. Here is his controversial Risala on family life, which is also framed as a tafsir, namely as a tafsir to Surat al-Mujadalah. And on the other hand, this is very much his opus magnum, Muqaddimah Tawil, which was published a few years ago by the members of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. And this very much builds upon the thought of Asindi and upon the major works of Shah Wali Ullah in the field like Hujjat al-Balira and Al-Fawz al-Kabir. Some of his main ideas in this work are that basically the Islamic message must be beneficial to all different millahs, as he says. So like Asindi, he has a very pluralistic approach to religious diversity, we could say. On the other hand, like Asindi, he also teaches that the interpretation of the Quran must be sensible to local contexts, and he also explicitly includes Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and other Eastern religions as part of the prophetic religions, which, like Christianity and Judaism, have shared values with Islam and the message of the Quran and the Prophet. I will now jump over the, no, I will not jump over the political background dynamics, just a few words. We already spoke about I said the Islamist opposition, the PAS party. So if the Islamists are the opposition, who are the ones running the show? So since Malaysian independence until 2018, or to a certain extent even until 2022, the show was always run by the same party, the United Malays National Organization, and especially under the longtime Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia was very much developing a very triumphalist Islam vis-a-vis its non-Muslim population, which makes up almost half of Malaysia's population. And likewise, under Mahathir Mohamad, we can see a very strong process of the bureaucratization of Islam, but also of the Islamization of the bureaucracy, and also a great push to strengthen the Sharia courts in the dual legal sphere of Malaysia. And this was, of course, enhanced through what we could say a political Islamization contest between the Islamist Path Party and the UMNO. Now, the figure in the middle basically was Anwar Ibrahim, who started out as an Islamist student leader in the 1970s, influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood and thinkers from the Muslim Brotherhood, became immensely popular in the 1980s. And first, Mahathir Mohamad tried to fight him, basically put him into jail, but then he took another strategy and co-opted him. So he co-opted him as interior minister. He even made him into his deputy prime minister. But then we can say Anwar Ibrahim, he took the fight against corruption a bit too seriously. So the prime minister had him removed and put him into jail on charges of sodomy, which was, of course, a completely political trial. And during his time in jail, Anwar Ibrahim, the former Islamist student leader, developed very much into a key figure in the pro-democracy movement, a key figure in the movement away from ethnic politics in Malaysia. And as such, he was also supported by members of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. So during his stint in jail, during Anwar Ibrahim's stint in jail, he founded, with the help of his wife, his own opposition party, and the Kelantan seat or the Kelantan center of Anwar Ibrahim's party was basically initially the house of Mir Abdul Aziz Mir Hassan, now the chief intellectual of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. And surprisingly enough, after a very long political struggle, in 2022, Anwar Ibrahim could rise to the premiership in Malaysia. But I can say that his erstwhile supporters from the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah are not completely satisfied with his performance as prime minister, because there is still no sign that he will really do away with the type of ethno-religious politics characterizing that has been characterizing Malaysia since independence, basically. So now I think I'm already running late. We come specifically to the last generation, the present carriers of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. That's Mir Abdul Aziz and his elder brother Mir Mahmud, who are both pictured here, both great-grandchildren of Tuan Tabal. As I said, through getting in touch with Mir Abdul Aziz, who did his own research on the family tradition, also from an academic perspective. So he's a trained historian, but of course also from a religious perspective, because he's now also the chief carrier of the teachings of his forefathers. And because of my personal relationship to him, I got access to highly interesting documents dating back as far as the 1930s. For example, here we can see a letter from the 1930s, part of the correspondence between Ubaidullah Sindhi and Van Musa, because Ubaidullah Sindhi and Van Musa became to correspond with each other after Mir Abdullah, Van Musa's son, became a student of Sindhi in Mecca. And also a very interesting document is this one here, which is in the handwriting of Van Musa. It is a bishara, so it is a kind of a true dream, a kind of a minor revelation. And in this bishara, Van Musa explains that he had doubts about the validity of the teachings which Sindhi was expounding to his son in Mecca, because he had been unaware of Shah Wali Ullah, he had been unaware of Sindhi, so he had doubts if that was basically the right path for his son to study. But then he had an intimation with the Prophet in a dream, and the Prophet, in the course of this bishara, affirmed that basically the teaching of Shāh Walī Allāh, they are the true teachings of the Prophet, which have become lost over time, but then were revived because, as the Bishara says, because Allah granted Shāh Walī Allāh ilham, that is basically divine inspiration, and so he could transmit the real teachings of the Prophet. Interestingly, and this is more like also the global relevance, perhaps, of this very specific Malaysian case. Al-Fawz al-Kabir is, of course, one of the most famous works of Shāh Walī Allāh, and when it was translated into English for the first time in 1985, the translator, G.N. Chalbani, he included the English translation of this Bishara into the book. So basically now all readers of the English translation of Fawz al-Kabir, they can also read about the Kelantanese family I'm talking about. So this is, part of the credentials, part of the truth claims behind the thought of Shāh Walī Allāh, which have also been appropriated by a Pakistani translator who accidentally came into contact with people from the Malaysian Tariq Shah Wali Ullah. Then, of course, it should be mentioned that Ubaidullah Sindhi, he had students from different regions, from different walks of life. And some of his students have interpreted his message, his reading of Shāh Walī Allāh in very different ways than the Malaysian scholars have been talking about here. We could mention, for example, Musa Jah Ali Bigir, a very famous reformist, Tatar reformist scholar, whose interpretation is, even though it has certain commonalities with perhaps the Malaysian Tariq Shah Wali Ullah, differs, I would suppose, in many respects. A more startling example we come upon here, that is Muhammad Tahir ibn Asif Khan, known as the Shaykh al-Quran of the Dar al-Quran of Panjshir in Pakistan. So Muhammad Tahir, he is known, he was also a student of Ubaidullah Sindhi, and he is known for having instituted a movement which is not just a religious movement in the narrow sense, but was also known for sending out vigilante groups into the villages in the Pashtun Afghan-Pakistan borderland, and forcing people into conforming with proper religious practice. To a certain extent, we can say that his movement is kind of Talibanesque, if I may use this word, but still it also claims to have received its prime inspiration from Dihlawī and Asindi. And this is also something I ask the present day representatives of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah in Malaysia about, that other people understand the teachings of Wali Allah or of Asindi, or interpret them and apply them in very different ways. And unsurprisingly, the response was that already Asindi had the feeling that the teachings of Shāh Walī Allāh are being misinterpreted in India. That's why he had to move away from Dar al-Ulum Deoband to found his own institution in Delhi. So the representatives of the Tariq in Malaysia, they are convinced that they are the ones who are interpreting Sindhi's and Shāh Walī Ullah's teachings most faithfully, and are applying them most successfully to their particular Malaysian context. This they are doing also via the production of literature. Nik Abdulaziz, Nik Hassan, for example, published, this is very much, as it says, a history of the development of the ulama of Kelantan. So this is very much an academic study on the ulama of Kelantan in general, but it was basically the first key work to really bring his family tradition into the spotlight, and also discuss the many ways in which their reformist impulse was marginalized by Malaysian ulama, and to a certain extent also by Malaysian aristocracies and political elites. So quite recent is this work, which is a collection of earlier work by Nik Abdulaziz. It's called Reform Ideas, Islamic Reform Ideas in Present Malaysia. So inspiration from the teachings of the ulama of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah, al-Dihlawī. And this is more or less a collection of old and new texts of Nik Abdulaziz, in which he applies specifically the teachings of Nik Le to the present Malaysian context. And this means that he, for example, greatly puts great stress on the religious pluralism, on the idea already propounded by Asindi, and then very forcefully by Nik Le, that basically religious pluralism is legitimate from an Islamic perspective, that basically the so-called constitution of Medina is a major proof of this claim, and then with regard to the present Malaysian context, that there is a tension between religious pluralism in a multi-religious society like Malaysia, and the secular state on one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that the Malaysian constitution specifies Islam as the official religion of the federation, and that this tension is also visible in the dual justice system in Malaysia, where we have civic courts and Sharia courts, and that this tension within the dual justice system is specifically evident in apostasy cases, as breaking off from Islam is simply not allowed in Malaysia, which Nik Abdulaziz sees as symbolic of an inferiority complex of the dominant Malay ethnicity. On the other hand, he also discusses in the work the question of hudud, one of the issues that was so important for the Islamist party, and he also discusses, like his precursor the idea of the Islamic state, like Nitle and Asindi works here very well as a role model, because Asindi, he was part, he did not join the Pakistan movement, but until his death, he collaborated with Gandhi and the likes in the construction of a multi-religious independent India. So he can be easily appropriated as a role model for a similar project in Malaysia, that is a multi-religious state in which Malay Muslims are not the dominant group, to the detriment of the other religions and ethnicity. So we can say that the teachings, the present teachings of the Tariq Shah Wali Ullah in Malaysia, they are very much against Malay ethnocentrism and against triumphalist state Islam. And one term which also was already used by Nitle, which is fairly interesting, is the term psychological feudalism. So as the state sultans are still officially the guardians of religion in Malaysia, Abdulaziz and his group, they view this system, this aristocratic system, as one important part of the problem. So, for example, the term Zalimun in the Quran was translated already by Mitle as a feudal mindset, and Abdulaziz commonly uses the term psychological feudalism, which is a form of, which is a breach of Tawhid and should be done away with. On the other hand, the group is also at the forefront of making, besides their own writings, they are at the forefront of making Shāh Walī Allāh's texts accessible to Malay readers. So they prepared and published, for example, a Malay summary translation of his key work, Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Good. So I will stop here and leave time for discussion. So we will start. We will end with the picture that was also at the start of this presentation. So this was an overview over a very specific family history, a history of Islamic scholarly family, seeing themselves and perceived locally as reformers, as reformists who were successively informed by different strands of new Islamic thought. First, the Aḥmadiyya-Idrīsiyya, Tariqa, then the reform movement of the Al-Manar group in Cairo, then the teachings of Ubaydullah Sindi, and yeah, who see their own mission as primarily revolving around the teachings of Shāh Walī Allāh al-Dihlawī, even though perhaps we could say that the most important reference is perhaps really Sindi and his interpretation of Shāh Walī Allāh. So thank you. I'm looking forward for questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Philipp. This was fascinating, and it's lovely you framed it with a picture. And thank you also for the very clear summary. I think this is a golden mine for everyone who study this specific topic, but also for the parallelisms and patterns can be very interesting for anyone for our studies. Thank you. I stop the recording and open the floor for questions. Oh, just before that, so